I was just thinking maybe I needed to do that bit.
Okay, I think we're live now. Just going to give it a moment for people to arrive. Welcome, everyone.
Yes, we are live.
Just going to give it a moment for people to arrive.
So I can see the messages and things. If people do arrive, where are we going to see that?
Okay, yeah. So I can see messages on my end, Stella, so I can respond to any messages that come in. So yeah, if you are here live, please feel free to say hello in the comments and let us know that you're here. And please feel free to use the chat as we are sharing and having this conversation, and feel free to ask questions as well.
Yeah, so we'll just give it a few moments, as Tara said.
Are you a woman in your
for anyone that is here? Yeah, I'm Stella. This is Tara. You might have come from either of our Instagram pages, but if you don't know me, hello, croeso, welcome. I'm calling in from Wales, on the British Isle, and it's really lovely to see you guys, whether you're here right now in this moment or you're watching a replay. I'm feeling very like this is a very precious moment, and I just wanted to just feel the sensitivity of this through all of us, and thank you for being sensitive and sort of not having the walls that this world likes to build around the heart.
Seeing some of your shares. So we have people calling in from Canada and the US. Hertfordshire. It says audio cutting in and out. Okay, hopefully you can all hear us okay. Please let us know if that continues. Yeah, welcome everyone.
Is it whose audio is cutting in and out? If you could, let us know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shall I do the landing, Stella? Does that sound good?
Well, if we're ready to, I'll just quickly introduce us before you bring us
Great
into that. Yeah, so as I was saying, you've likely come from the Instagram post that we shared 2 days ago now, that was something that has been like heavy on our hearts, and a deep passion for both of us. But we have both come together quite recently in the past few months and found that we are both just as passionate about this conversation that isn't easily had, and we've both been talking about it on our own, on our individual Instagram pages. And I have found it difficult to kind of like hold this on my own, it seemed, for quite a while. So I'm really grateful that Tara is also wanting to have this conversation, because it is a conversation that needs to be had between multiple people, especially multiple people from different parts of the world with different experiences, with a shared intention, which is to, as Tara says, and a word that really stuck out to me the other day was to repair. This is to repair and not divide, which within the Instagram world, it can seem like division is the intention when there's a lot of that happening in the comments. But I'm sure those of you here are open enough to know that the division is not what we're here for. That is not our intention. Our intention here is to repair. And then Tara is now going to bring us into just land and ground and just, get into this.
Yeah, so welcoming all of you who are here and just joining, and inviting everyone to just close their eyes for a few moments and to take a few deep breaths, really feeling the spirit of the land where you are, feeling your connection to the earth. Stella mentioned that she's in Wales, and I am on the ancestral lands of the Ute and Arapaho people in so-called Colorado, really honoring all of the different places that we're calling in from for this conversation. And as Stella shared, this is a really sensitive topic and a conversation that Stella and I are really passionate about, and really feel that the importance of it, and that there aren't really that many people having this conversation. So may we hold ourselves with a lot of gentleness. And I invite all of you listening to just bring in a sense of gentleness to your body, maybe bringing your hands to your heart or breathing a little deeper. Inviting in that gentleness so that we can come to this conversation with an open heart, with curiosity, in the spirit of repair and restoration that is so deeply needed. And I'd also like to honor and welcome in our wise and well ancestors. Feeling the ancestors, especially from the British Isles, from England and from Wales, and all of the other beautiful regions and territories of these islands. Feeling these wise and well ancestors holding us in this conversation. And for those of you who don't know me, it is truly my devotion to the ancestors that drives me and really inspires me and motivates me to have these conversations, even when these conversations are difficult. And it is through my listening to the ancestors that I bring forth my perspective. I'm always in communication with them. So honoring my ancestral guides in this moment. Thank you, thank you, thank you, dear ancestors, for guiding me in this conversation, feeling your presence in this moment. Maljeo. In Proto-Celtic, the word maljeo means praise or thanks. So we say maljeo to these ancestors who are stepping in to help us hold this conversation, to help strengthen us and keep our hearts open. Thank you, everyone, for that. And passing back to you, Stella.
Yeah, so there were many questions that could be said and asked. There were many questions I wanted to and that were coming through, but really the few that I'm going to be bringing are going to be so like juicy that they can be unpacked over like an entire book if we wanted to. I'm sure me and Tara could write entire books on these singular questions. So I'm interviewing Tara. I'm the one that's got the questions, and I have got both English and Welsh ancestry. My Instagram page is mainly about the Welsh traditions and the Brythonic traditions from these areas at the moment, because I'm really connecting to my local environment, re-inhabiting my local landscape. But I also have the English, so I just wanted to say that, because when you go onto my page and my, you know, what I do, it doesn't quite look like that. But I do. My great granddad is London area and Middle England, and then on the other side, my family go back really far into Wales, as far as we know. So this conversation and these questions I'm going to be asking now are going to be about honouring the English ancestry, and that is the land that we now call England, which I feel is important to, just to understand and hold this England and English ancestry and English tradition, English culture as the land, not necessarily what we now know today as Empire England. So yes, Tara, if I could just share something that I'd read, which was the intention for me coming to learn from someone with English ancestry in America who isn't afraid to look at the colonial history of her lineage and is on the path towards decolonization, and to share where I can relate as someone who also has English ancestry, while acknowledging that my Brythonic Welsh ancestors were the first to be colonized by the British Empire, and how today Welsh cultural stories are often believed to be English stories, and where there are crossovers, and why we as individuals find these topics important. So, Tara, why is it important for you? Why are you doing this really? What is this? Why is your spiritual journey bringing you to a place where you're exploring your English ancestry? And why is it hand in hand with like making sure that you're not bypassing the harms of the English Empire?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stella. Really honoring your intention and sharing in that intention. We all hold pieces of this remembering that I feel so many of us are committed to or wanting to commit to. And I truly feel that this remembering is about honoring our lineages in their wholeness, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? And so just to give a little context for everyone about who I am. So I am American, as you can tell from my voice, but I actually spent a lot of my childhood in England, most of my childhood. And my father is English. I have lots of English family. I visit often. So I have very deep roots in England and had my own personal experience of growing up inside the English culture. So I became interested in, quote, Celtic paganism and the Celtic traditions, and I'm using quotations for a reason, which I'm sure we'll get into later, when I was 18, when I was still living in England. And this really was a moment of sort of remembering for me and awakening, because I was really hearing the call of the land to remember the ancestors and to remember our ancient heritage, our ancient roots. And so that's really what got me started on this path. And I started very young, when I was 18. And this path meandered over time and led me to explore my Irish ancestry once I was living here in the United States. And I became really passionate about my Irish ancestry and went to Ireland and spent 2 months there. And it really sort of initiated me into a deeper level of ancestral tradition and honoring the ancestors and cultural heritage and all of these things, and doing repair work with my Irish ancestry. And after a number of years on that path, I slowly began to see and understand that it was really important for me to also honor and look at my English ancestry. So this led me on a path to really explore why I was so resistant to connecting with my English ancestry. And this led to me understanding that I actually had some pretty strong feelings of shame about my English ancestry. And I know that this is a feeling that many share. Obviously not everyone, but I have worked with many, many women over the years who feel that sense of shame about being English, who, when asked in a multicultural circle, what's your ancestry? And they kind of go, I'm English, like they whisper it, because there's that feeling of shame, right? And this shame directly comes from the harms of the British Empire, right? So I became very aware of this on my own path and realized that I really needed to unpack this and to understand the shame and to move through it somehow. And so that really led me on this journey into the deeper layers and the deeper roots of what it means to be, quote, English. And it's important to honor here that, England has only been England since the 900s. And before that, England was very much part of Brythonic Britain. So as Stella mentioned, when I'm talking about England, I'm really talking about the lands that we now call England. And I wish that there was a better way to describe that, but I don't know that there is, right? So we're talking about this very specific land and nation that we now call England, honoring that England has its own unique identity, in part because of the British Empire and our unique history within the British Isles, and also honoring that England is part of Britain and was very much part of Brythonic Britain before the Anglo-Saxons came. So there's a lot of complex history to be with, to understand, to honor, in terms of what we call England and how we relate to being English, right? So my primary focus, once I started getting interested in the deeper roots and heritage of what it means to be English, really brought me to the pre-colonial and pre-Christian traditions. And I started to understand that this word Celtic that we see thrown around a lot is very overused and misunderstood, and often incorrect in its use. And I started to really also feel and understand, especially because of my Irish ancestry, that, you know, there was this sort of, I could see that people in England were sometimes going to the Celtic traditions of, let's say, Wales or Ireland or Scotland or Cornwall and kind of claiming them as their own. And I started to see that this was problematic for a number of different reasons. And I started to really feel the complexity of this and the pain of this. So, you know, for example, I have heard many people in Ireland sort of say, you know, the English are kind of coming to our traditions going, oh, well, I'm wanting to connect with the Celtic traditions. And so they were going to Ireland and basically appropriating the Irish traditions. And let's remember that Ireland was deeply colonized by England, and the same is true in Wales, right? And so here's where there's complexity, right? It's like, how do we hold our Celtic, Brythonic, ancient roots and our sort of Celticness, which is, you know, complex in nature, and honor all of the history that's happened since then, right? It's like we can't bypass all of that history, right, from the pre-Anglo-Saxon era to where we are now, right? So we can't just bypass the British Empire and appropriate from our Celtic neighbors in the name of reclaiming our roots, right? Our ancient roots. So this obviously is very complex. And it led me onto this path of going, well, what is ours to reclaim as people from England with this identity today in the modern world that is very much English, right? And how do we connect to our Brythonic past in a way that doesn't appropriate from the Welsh traditions or, you know, our Celtic neighbors, right? So that's really been my personal approach. And I have tried to bring as much sensitivity as possible to these complexities, right? And so to come back to your question, Stella, of why it's important for us with English ancestry to embrace our heritage, you know, I feel that if we deny our ancestors and we deny our heritage, we really hold ourselves back from being who we fully are and who we truly are, right? And all of the different aspects of our identity and history as people who are English, right? And I also see many people in England appropriating from other cultures, right? So the appropriation isn't just happening within, you know, Britain and Ireland, but also elsewhere in the world, right? And I think that comes from a deep wound of feeling that we don't have our own ancestral traditions to return to, that we don't have an intact culture to reclaim. And while it is true that our heritage is very fragmented, you know, we do have an opportunity to put together those fragments, those threads, those pieces, and really feel our own sense of identity and heritage rooted in the lands that our ancestors were connected to throughout time, right? Throughout many different waves of invasion and, you know, being conquered and what have you, right? We do have a very complex history. And so there are many different threads to follow and many different pieces to put back together. So in other words, I realized I had to fucking do the work. Like there was not going to be an easy shortcut to just suddenly go, oh, here's this intact English heritage that I can connect to that takes me all the way back into, you know, Celtic Brythonic Britain. Like, no, you know, it's work. And so that has been my journey over the past few years in particular, to really focus on that. And what a beautiful journey it has been. It has not been easy. And as I have spoken up about these complex issues and topics, it's, you know, I get a lot of pushback, and it's not easy, right, to hold this perspective or to talk about my personal approach in this way, because there is a lot of complexity and sensitivity. So that's kind of been my personal approach and the reason why it feels important. And I can tell you now that I have truly moved through that shame that I spoke about earlier. I don't feel ashamed of my English ancestry anymore because I have really, really been in communion with my ancestors and really come to understand my own heritage and the beauty of that, and also learn from the pain of it too. We don't have to feel shame about the British Empire and our history of colonialism if we truly reckon with it on a deep level, and also see how we can be the change that is needed to repair, right, through decolonization, through honoring the true history of the empire and the harms, and do that important repair work that's so desperately needed. So I think those feel like the most important points to share, and we'll pass back to you, Stella.
Mm. Mm. Yes. So the one thing that that's coming to me now from the many things that you spoke of was the cultural appropriation topic, and just pointing out that a lot of the words that we're using here have got stigma attached to them, and they are not very understood in the sort of mainstream world as to what they truly mean. And then when talking about them, there are a lot of preconceived ideas surrounding what they really mean, and they could mean something different to one person to the next, which is very true with a lot of what we're talking about. And just to remember that we're having a conversation about spirituality, and this is our personal journey and our personal exploration for our personal reasons for exploring not just the earth and our ancestors, but the cosmos itself. So for us to just be gentle with each other's spiritual and religious journeys in these discussions and conversations, and be open and curious to talk, to learn from one another. I think that's the most important thing, because as you said, with the cultural appropriation, it is the byproduct of there being so much lost, and the people of these British lands and people with ancestors here not having something solid to grasp onto in terms of connecting to ancestry and lineage, not having something like a manual or a manuscript that is here to tell you what the teachings are of your people. There is no sort of indigenous framework that is guiding us. And as much as we can ask with deep gratitude for the elders of the surviving Indigenous traditions to help us return to who we are, it's not as easy because of many reasons. And with the cultural appropriation, it's like that comes with I feel it is something that a lot of people go through, and I have for sure gone through that. When I had my spiritual awakening, I was appropriating cultures because I went out to look and seek answers to help me understand the experiences I was going through, and it was the answers from other cultures that provided that that thing that I could relate to, and I could be like, wow, I really relate to that based on my own experience. And then I appropriated it, and I don't feel that shame for doing that now. I look back at it and I think that was a part of my path, and I noticed it straight away, and I was like, right, that's not right. I'm going to learn about that culture, and then I'm going to move along. And then I've started to return to my own culture, and I think a lot of people get stuck in this shame of then they don't want to look at themselves, whether it is appropriated from another culture, or they don't want to look at their own lineage. And um, with our English and British Empire lineage, people don't want to look at the truth of what's actually there, so they sort of carry on, marching with the colonial drum in a sense, because they don't want to look at who they really are and what they're really doing. And this can represent as people in the new age who are just like, their outward appearance doesn't look anything like who they are inwardly. Or it can look like people who are absolutely disagreeing with any comment we make on how our ancestors actually have made big mistakes, and we do need to start decolonizing. And that it really takes looking, like having a mirror in front of us and looking at like who we truly are. And that if you are in a position, or if anyone is in a position and figuring out like how to do this, like be gentle with yourself, like hold yourself, and as Tara said, go into your own ancestral connections, whatever that means for you, and like know that it's okay to feel shit, know that it's okay to feel grief, know that it's okay to feel the loss of what your people have gone through, what perhaps the people on the land you are on now are going through. And it is actually through these deeper emotions that we start to embody more of a wholeness. I think in our society today, we are like so avoidance of real, true, deep emotions, especially when it comes to community and like collective grief and community grief, which is which has got a lot to do with this. But there are some things that we can do um, that can bring us, once we've moved through that, once we've moved through those emotions and that acceptance, there are some things that we can do and think, okay, so I'm going to actually look at my lineage and my ancestry, but like where to start. You know, a lot of you probably is like, where the fuck do I start? Like, where do I start with this? I've got ancestors from here, here, here. England at the time, or Britain at the time, there were many different tribes who had many different beliefs, and we don't know what they were doing or what they were believing. So really, Tara, what I want to ask is like, what are the things that you personally on your journey after moving through, you know, as what you've just spoken about, that journey to returning and feeling that shame and then moving on from it, what are you doing now, and how is it that you are honoring this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it feels important to say that connecting with my ancestry, my English ancestry and heritage, actually helped me move through the shame. It's not like I did that after the shame. It all was woven together. So, you know, I really, like I said, there are many pieces and fragments. And so really my approach was to start gathering some of those pieces. So my approach in this way, again, with a focus on pre-Christian and pre-colonial traditions in particular, though I do really honor some of the more recent English traditions as well, you know, it was to look at archaeology, because archaeology can tell us a lot about what our ancestors were doing, what they found to, like, what they revered and thought and felt to be important. And so there's much that archaeology can tell us, especially in things like the way people are buried and what they were buried with and these kinds of things. And then mythology and stories. So this is something we can talk about more in a few minutes, but I really began to see that some of the mythology that is relevant to England specifically has these maps of remembrance that can help us to remember our pre-Christian, pre-colonial past. And truly these myths, which again, we'll talk about more in a minute, they have their roots in pre-Christian, pre-colonial Britain. So although they've been Christianized because they were written down in the medieval period, you know, these stories were had a much deeper history and were passed down through many generations orally before being written down. And many of these stories traveled, and, you know, and so there was a lot of cultural exchange happening. And again, we'll talk more about that later. But the mythology was this really key piece on that journey, as well as folklore and stories from England, of which we have a huge amount of material to work with. And then the other piece was just talking directly to my ancestors, learning how to talk to them, and especially working with wise and well ancestors who you heard me call in at the beginning. And it feels really important to mention and say and emphasize that everyone has wise and well ancestors. You know, I hear sometimes people from England say, well, you know, my ancestors were colonizers, or, you know, they were entangled in the, you know, the system of colonization in these harmful ways. Like, I don't know how to connect to well ancestors, you know, and so my emphasis is always to actually go really far back in the lineage and connect to the ancestors who are pre-colonial, pre-Christian, who were connected to the earth. And we all have these ancestors. So, you know, again, this is a real honoring of the true depth of our lineage and its wholeness, right? And so working with those wise and well ancestors and learning to talk to them and listen to them really gave me a gateway into understanding how to start putting some of these pieces together, from the folklore and mythology to archaeology, history, you know, the writings of the Romans about the Druids. I mean, there are many different sources and many different pieces to put together. And so the ancestors really guided that process. And I'm continuing to be in that process with them, listening to them and understanding how to move through these challenging and painful aspects of self and lineage, right, that are entangled with colonialism. And I feel so important to say that, colonialism never ended. It just became normalized. And, thinking about this on a global scale, there are many, many different territories and lands that are still incredibly colonized, including where I live here on Turtle Island, right? So-called America. This is an incredibly colonized country where Indigenous people are still suffering really deeply. And then if we look at the British Isles and Ireland, the wound of colonization is still very present from the British Empire. And I would say also going back further, especially for those of us with English ancestry, the Romans came, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Vikings and the Normans. Like we had 1,000 years of people coming to control and conquer and colonize our lands, right, in different ways. So there's really a lot for us to move through and reckon with. And something that I have noticed on my journey is that the deeper the reckoning, the deeper the remembering. And this is something that the ancestors have shown me again and again and again. The more that we're willing to, sit and look and stay with these colonial wounds in their many forms, the more that we're able to look at that and be with that and go into that, the more we're able to remember about our pre-colonial, pre-Christian ancestors and our ancestral ways, the threads that take us from today all the way back through time, through all of those different peoples and the ways that people evolved and, carried on traditions in different ways over many, many generations. So, I would even say that, some of the English traditions today, which are rooted in, England, have their roots in a very ancient past, right? It's like these traditions never truly died. They just evolved over time. And so for just to give one example, in England and all of Britain and Ireland as well, the reverence for the sacred wells has been important forever, I would say, and it's that honoring of the sacred water, the fact that the water nourishes and sustains us. We need water to live, and that there is a reverence around that. And our ancestors had this really beautiful way of connecting to the wells, right? And so we still have traditions that relate to the sacred wells. They've never been lost. And so there are, again, these threads that have survived and evolved through the ages that are rooted in, the spirit in all things and animistic belief systems, right? Of which all people all around the world, at one point or another in history, they honored the spirit in all things. And Britain was no different. And England was no different, right? So yeah, it's really been a beautiful process of, like I said, reclaiming different pieces, being with the ancestors, not being afraid to look at these painful aspects of our history, from the British Empire and the identity of the colonizer to, the 1,000 years I spoke to in which we were, conquered and colonized and what have you in different ways. So yeah, I feel like that's enough to share for now. Thank you for that question, Stella.
Yeah, so the ways in which we can all, honor honor these pasts in the same way that Tara has, through connecting to our ancestors, which I'd say definitely have a look at Tara's work afterwards, and the many different ways in which you can do that, which is it's not surface level. Like connecting with your ancestors isn't a lot of the time isn't a surface level task in a sense. It does take work, just like all of this does, and it's something that I'm currently on the path towards doing, because for me the journey towards listening to my ancestors, listening to the people in my lineage, and not just blood but the people from the land that I'm on now, has come quite like spontaneously, in terms of receiving the message, or receiving the answers, or receiving the gnosis, but it came alongside the deep work around it. So I recently had a very powerful experience where I was and as you said, like, it's through the deep reckoning, the more powerful the remembering is. So my experience was a deep, deep grief and longing and loss, and anger. It was like all these emotions at the same time, for what my ancestors have gone through and what they have put others through. But it was the land that showed me and told me. It was like the trees around me, and the meadow was like so I was opening my heart, and the more it was asking me to open my heart, the more I was like wanting to cry and scream, and I was actually just like really feeling it. It was really fucking intense. And yeah, it was, as you just said, that deep remembering. It came alongside that deep reckoning. And funnily enough, it coincided with returning to a sacred well, returning to a spring that hadn't really seen humans for um, probably about 15 years. And then prior to that, hundreds of years. And it was through reuniting with this water that something in me unlocked, and the ancestors of the land of my lineage spoke through me in such a powerful way, which is one of the reasons we're actually having this conversation right now, because I know that you've felt very similar things. And it's not something where I was like actually wanting to like get in, and I didn't go into like an ancestral past life meditation. It just sort of like happened because I was feeling and longing, and then it was just this overwhelming experience where it's like, oh shit, like this is real. Like, and it's actually really helped me to, and I don't know if this might relate to some of the audience out there, but I realized that my deep love for the natural world, and the environment, isn't just Stella here today who's interested in climate change. It's a deep longing and remembering that these things have been neglected, and they are, like, in a sense, screaming for us to come back to them. I always sort of thought I'm just an environmentalist and that's what's put onto us, but it's a lot deeper than that. And yeah, the waters, really, when you start connecting to the waters, and like, it might sound silly to people who aren't, but things start to make more sense. And for me, that's how it's been in my experience. And yeah, the water reverence and honoring is practical. It's good to know that this water, this spring water, is healthy, because then you know that your tribe are going to be okay. Your people are going to be okay. Your community is going to be okay. And this is a tradition that isn't like an ancient tradition that has no reason for being here today. The connection to the water, the respecting the water, the knowing what the fuck water is, and that we are water, and that this big, beautiful blue ball of water that we call Earth is no different. This is a tradition that is it should never have changed, and it's never going to go away. I think a lot of people look at what we're doing from the outside and say, oh, you're trying to live in the past, you're trying to, we're different, this is the modern world. Like, why are you trying to bring back traditions from the past? And it's like, because of they are still so relevant today. And it is the stories and the folklore and the stories that we tell ourselves about the world around us that guide how we are going to interact with it, which is why stories about like honoring and revering water they're not fairy tales. They're really important to know, because if they remind us that we should care for not only ourselves but the natural world. So just sort of on the topic of the water and the mythology, where did water, and I wasn't going to ask this, but I'm intrigued, where did water come into your journey with all of this?
Hmm.
Was it the stories? Was it an experience you had?
Yeah, I think, well, both. There are so many different myths and stories throughout Britain and Ireland, that this is truly something that is cross-cultural and shared amongst all of our different cultures and regions and identities. The water is very present in so many stories and is very connected to the sacred feminine. So many, many different wells are named after female deities, including in England, and there's this real sense of that nourishment that is, brought forth from the water, right? And I love what you were sharing earlier, Stella, about the reverence for the water and the way people related to water. And I had this deep remembering while connecting with some of the wells in England, actually, that, the health and wellness of the well was a direct reflection of the health and wellness of the people. Like before we got this very, very, um, before basically we had this money economy, right? Before we started placing value on things that could be monetized, right? It's like there was this deep understanding, at least this is what my ancestors have told me and what I understand from the stories and traditions of the wells, is this sense of the wealth and wellness of the people being connected to the sacred wells. And then I spent 2 months in Ireland connecting with one of Bridget's wells. And I've spent lots of time connecting with wells in England as well. So this really feels like a beautiful sort of entry point into these traditions. So I love that you're asking this, Stella, because anyone can go sit with water and understand the cultural context within which our ancestors revered the water through stories and through tradition, and have that relationship. So, a lot of these traditions are about relationships, right? Ancestral traditions are about relationships. And this is something that is so devoid in our modern world, right? Because there is this deep severing and separation from the land and from each other. Like there's so much division and harm and what have you that has been intentionally weaponized to separate us, right, from ourselves and from our humanity, truly. So what you're talking about, Stella, of being in relationship with the wells and being in relationship with the water, like that's such a simple and beautiful and precious aspect of our humanness that can never truly be taken from us. And so I feel that, either by sitting with sacred wells, if you live in Britain, or by sitting with water wherever you live, if you live outside of those lands, you can create this relationship and this connection and understand that your ancestors throughout time have honored the water in these very sacred ways. And I'll also mention here, because we're talking about this, that I'm hosting a workshop in a few weeks called Women of the Wells, and would love to welcome anyone who wants to come along to that workshop. And we're going to be talking specifically about a really important story from the mythology of Britain that talks about women of the wells. So that would be a great introduction for those of you who are interested in connecting with the English, quote, English traditions, right? We understand all what I'm saying when I'm saying English. It's England and the lands we now call England. So this would be a great entry point, a way for you to understand the context of what is meant by, the sacred water and ancestral traditions around water. So I will be sure to share the link to that workshop at the end of this talk.
I'll be there at that workshop. Yes. So the well that I'm talking about, well, the spring that I'm talking about that gave me that experience was like a fucking muddy puddle at the end of the day, but it was a spring. And yeah, like for people who perhaps you don't know where if there are wells around you, there likely are actually. Every time I drive through England or Wales and I look on the maps to try and find a sacred space for water, there's not one very far. But this was a muddy puddle, guys, and it looked like it. But just when we brought the roses around it and we decorated it once more and we started singing to it was transformational, because this water that comes up through a spring has been filtering itself for sometimes thousands of years before it sees the light of day. Like it hasn't seen the light of day or fresh air for thousands of years. It's been purifying itself to literally feed us, to sustain us, to nourish us. So it's deep, even though it might just look like a little puddle. It's deep. I've got some friends who have actually recently gone out looking at old OS maps, and they are going to they've got like their bramble cutters, and they're going and reviving these springs, and it's really cool. My friend the other day shared a little video of her just sat there with her guitar, like singing to the water that she just found like not far from her house among all of these bramble bushes. And I was just like, oh my god, it's amazing. Like I've started something so beautiful among my friendship group, um, and they're all just feeling it, man. It's really, 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 really like such a treasure to be found, and it's an adventure, and it's so fun, and yeah, just to come to yeah, to come back out of the water and back to the cultural appropriation that I was talking about earlier, and to move into the last question, um, which was about, yeah, like, well, I'm here because of my page is all about the Welsh traditions, and it's funny because I had no idea that my own Welsh culture could be appropriated, even by myself, weirdly. Because when I started looking into Welsh spirituality, Welsh paganism, Welsh witchcraft, just anything that was Welsh and spiritual, I was given a load of culturally appropriated like resources. Actually, much of modern Wicca, much of modern paganism is heavily influenced by the old Welsh and Brythonic stories without any reference to them being Welsh or Brythonic. So I found books on Welsh gods and goddesses, and I was like, yay, these Welsh gods and goddesses. And I was putting them on my altar because some of these resources said that they were honored and worshipped as gods and goddesses pre Rome, but they actually weren't, which was disheartening for me because I hadn't fully researched before sort of identifying with these things. And this is what makes this so hard. It's research. It takes research, and it takes knowing how to research, which isn't easy. So it is not your fault. It's not my fault. It's no one's fault that we might get things wrong on this path, because it's not easy to research. Research is actually a skill that's gained through either like being in university or school or through like experience. And my yeah, like I like to say that Hollywood and like wizard culture, in a sense, is culturally appropriating the ancient spiritual leaders of Wales and the Brythonic lands in England. Um, and it's like it was a long time ago, so it's not something where I feel like I want to defend. I love fantasy, and it actually brings to life and brings it forward a lot that has been lost. But it is a misrepresentation of what perhaps the druids were like. You know, people sort of think of the druids and they think of this wizard-like character, which is an accurate description of what the druids were like across the Celtic period. Or people might think of the Welsh gods and goddesses and think of like Ceridwen, Mabon, Rhiannon, but really, actually, these were characters from a book called The Mabinogi, and this book is a book of stories and a book of fables. And we today can associate these characters with like gods or deities, but they're actually more like human beings, with magical abilities that move in between the realms of the human and the magical, that move in between the other world and this world that we live in today. So they are deeply relatable, which is why modern paganism has sort of grasped onto them. But I think it is important to know where they come from. And I don't know many people who are doing that, who have looked deep enough into it to know that there is a difference between the sort of modern pagan perspective on what perhaps gods and goddesses were like in the like English or Brythonic or Welsh word. Like it's kind of like this big amalgamation of fantasy. And then there's you, Tara, who's actually like done the research and has looked into it and is like, well, you've got your English lineage, so it doesn't quite make sense for you to hone in on these, well, for you personally, like to hone in on these Welsh traditions and stories, and like, oh, actually, what are these Welsh traditions and stories, or where do they come from? So yeah, the last question was around why is it, what was it? Where is it? Why is it important for you to leave the Welsh stories out of this, and where have you seen the English and Welsh stories blend in ways that they perhaps shouldn't? And this isn't to say, guys, that you're not allowed to look at the Welsh stories and you're not allowed to explore them. This is just Tara's personal, like your personal experience, isn't it? Like this is
Mhm.
you. Yeah, this is something that's important to you, and I see it now as important because they are so kind of like elevated, perhaps in the wrong way, yes, but they're so elevated, they're so pushed to the front. And then so much of what was going on in England is just completely like ignored in a sense, and not even uncovered, like not even dug up. Like you're sort of like digging up this stuff that's been like deeply buried for so long. And um yeah, like what is this bit about?
Yeah, thank you, Stella. So, yeah, just to emphasize, what I'm going to share is just what feels most integrous to me. So, this is just my approach, and this is very complex, right? So, as I was sharing earlier, when people want to connect with their Celtic Brythonic roots in England, it often leads to people not really understanding that England has traditions and goddesses and deities and what have you, but they're buried very deep, and that it's easier to find information and teachings about, let's say, the Welsh gods and goddesses and the Welsh traditions or the Irish traditions or what have you. But the problem here that I really deeply see and feel and know that I'm not alone is that there is this colonial wound between Wales and England. And I'm going to just talk about these two because just for simplicity and because me and Stella are having this conversation. So we're going to talk about England and Wales. So there's this deep colonial wound that has not been fully repaired. Again, colonialism never ended, it just became normalized. So just to try to emphasize this and give an example, the Welsh myths were written in Old Welsh, right? And so when you're reading the Welsh mythology, you're reading an English translation of them, most likely, unless you happen to speak Welsh and are familiar with Old Welsh. And Welsh was literally beaten out of the Welsh people because of the colonization of England. And Stella, I know that your family has a personal experience with this, right? And so this is just one example of colonialism and the wound that is still present because from what I understand, Stella, most people in Wales do not speak Welsh. Like there's a revival of learning the language and what have you, but maybe actually you want to speak to that for a moment before I continue.
Yes, so most people don't speak Welsh fluently. Everyone since 1999 will have had to have learned it in school, but it was only since 1999 that it became mandatory in school. Before that, even in the Church of England schools, um, you weren't taught about Wales, you weren't taught about Welsh history. Like my uncle was in a school in Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, which is on the west coast. It's like far, far, far into Wales, and he didn't learn anything about the Welsh language, Welsh history. It was the Church of England school. He got taught all about royalty. He got taught all about their family and the history of England. Um, and in my personal story with so the reason that I don't speak Welsh is because it was beaten out of my great nan, who she's alive today, her mum. And before then, the Welsh language was spoken fluently in my family. And it's only in the past 3 generations that it hasn't been. Yeah, so when I'm listening to perhaps my Welsh friends sing, or I'm going to Welsh folk events, it's actually like really fucking sad. Like I'm there, like I can't, I can't hear you. Like I don't know what you're saying. So I'm on this journey to learn again, because I know all of my English answer. Well, not all of it. Like I'm actually learning through time now. Like the land's ancestry, I call, like this is the land's traditions. Um, but yeah, I guess that's what I've got to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And literally in school, there was children were punished for speaking Welsh. Literally,
Right, the
we'd
Welsh
have
knot. Did you want me to say
Welsh
what?
not. Yeah, could you say more about that?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So the punishment was called the Welsh knot, and it was a little like wooden plaque that had the word "not" on it, and it was like the punishment was that if you spoke Welsh in primary school now, like from toddler age, like from toddler years, if you spoke Welsh, you'd be punished by wearing it. And at the end of the day, if you were the one still wearing it, you would be like whipped, like severely beaten. So that's how the system turned the people from speaking Welsh into English, because of the children were so afraid to speak their own language, um, they would like tell on their friends. It's like if I found out I didn't want to get beaten, so I would tell on my friend if they slipped up, sort of thing. And it didn't take, yeah, I guess it didn't take very long for it to now be a language that is, yeah, there's so much shame with the Welsh people as well as the English people. There's a lot of shame put onto us, and you can see it even in the difference in, um, yeah, especially with Welsh women, like the difference in like how what we will strive for, like economically, career wise, in school, in education, like in comparison to England. It's like it's wild because of that shame that's been put on our language.
Thank you, Stella. That context is really important, because when English people decide, oh, I want to embrace Welsh mythology and Welsh gods and goddesses as my own, there's a lack of sensitivity about that context, right? And so there is this appropriation and this colonial wound within that often isn't acknowledged or honored, right? So it feels important for those of us with English ancestry to educate ourselves about the harms of the British Empire and why it's important to be really sensitive about how we embrace our own heritage, right? And honor these colonial wounds, even within this very small part of the world, like Britain and Ireland, just understanding as much as we can the history that has happened there and the history of colonialism there. And then, you can go learn about, colonialism elsewhere in the world too, which is obviously equally as important, especially if you live outside of, the British Isles and what have you. So learning about this colonial history and then going, okay, what is the most integrous and sensitive way that I can reclaim my heritage without appropriating, let's say, from Wales? And the reason why Wales is so important is because England and Wales were very, 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 like, there was no separation in Brythonic Britain between England and Wales, right? And so we have to kind of walk between these two truths, that yes, we were part of Brythonic Britain, and Wales holds a lot of wisdom about Brythonic Britain today, and the truth that there are these colonial wounds, right? So how do we walk between those two truths? And that's really what I try to do as much as possible. So in my own approach, it feels deeply inappropriate to connect with the Mabinogion, which Stella mentioned earlier, and with the Welsh gods and goddesses. And the Mabinogion talks a lot about the Welsh gods and goddesses. So for me, that's like, yes,
yeah,
please.
just to touch in on that again, they're not Welsh gods and goddesses, so they were never honored or worshipped as gods or goddesses. Some of the characters that you might see today, like if you type, for example, if I type in today on Google Welsh gods and goddesses, Cynnos comes up in that list. And Cynnos is a a Germanic deity, a deity from Europe. It's got no connection to Wales, and then it might come up with Rhiannon, who there's no evidence to suggest that she was ever actually honored or worshipped as a goddess. This is people wanting to connect to something, and it is like comparative mythology in a sense. Like this is actually quite important to bring up. A lot of what we do know and what we say we know and understand about the so-called Celtic world, and I think we should at the end touch on that word Celtic, is we've looked at other surviving indigenous cultures around the world and we've said, oh, this is what it looks like. It looks like they're talking about another world. For example, in the Welsh otherworld, where these gods and goddesses come out of the water, we call it a Welsh otherworld in the English language, because the English language cannot do justice what the original people of these lands actually believed or understood. So the Welsh otherworld is actually called Anufn, which translates to the inner deep world. It actually has no sort of other there, but we've looked at other parts of the world and been like, oh, these characters look like they goddess like, so we're just going to slap the word goddess onto them. But they weren't. And and there's even like, for me, I've thought that I was honoring an ancient Welsh goddess, but I wasn't. She was just mentioned in the stories, which is very different. But then there are, as you've found, there are actually deities and goddesses that aren't from the Mabinogi, that are from places in England that are so close to the border of what we now call England and Wales. So yeah, just to touch on that,
Mm-hmm.
they weren't they weren't gods and goddesses in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for clarifying that, Stella. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. And I think the point that I really wanted to make was like, people today, Welsh people today, who are reclaiming and remembering their ancestral heritage and what have you, often, as far as I understand what you said, take these characters from the Mabinogion and give them the status of a god or goddess. So Ceridwen or Rhiannon or what have you. And so there is this evolution of tradition, if you will. And so all I meant to say was that those figures, those mythic figures who are now like elevated to a status of god or goddess, are like off limits to me. Like that feels important and integrous on my path. Does that? Yes, thank you for
that totally makes sense. And I want to say, like, I actually see Ceridwen as a deity today based on my modern vision on the ancient wisdom. So I'm not saying that you can't. I mean, like, I actually would really love for people to like look at, like, if you can connect to Ceridwen and you can see like, wow, I actually like her as an archetype or a deity. Like, there's nothing wrong with you doing that, but know the origins of it. You know, don't have this idea in your head that she was honored by all of these Welsh people at this one time, because she wasn't quite like that.
Yes.
But yes, yeah, just to go.
Yes, thank you. So there is this evolution of tradition and reclamation of ancient mythology in Wales and what have you, that's so important to the revitalization of Welsh culture, right? So that's why that feels off limits for me. I'm like watching all of you, and like all of you who are doing that work in Wales, like cheering you on and going, that is not like something that I am is appropriate for me to engage with. Yeah. And at the same time, like it is truly impossible to completely separate Wales and England because of our shared Brythonic past. And so there are some Welsh stories that I do connect with, especially the ones that talk about England, because there are some important Welsh stories and texts that talk specifically about England and actually give us a lot of information about England and our own heritage, right? So there are some exceptions. And again, this is just my approach. So for example, when I teach the Women of the Wells workshop in a few weeks, we're going to look at it's a Welsh story called The Elucidation, but it's set in Logres, which is the Arthurian word. Like within Arthurian context, that word references England. It's basically the rough representation of England in those stories. So it's not to say that like we have to completely like cut off all of the Welsh stories, because some of them are relevant to our identity and our heritage. And in that story of the elucidation, and in other stories that talk about Logres in the Arthurian text and in the Grail mysteries, Logres is always what is called the wasteland. So in other words, England is the wasteland in these stories. And I find that so fascinating. And in this mythic sense, it's become part of that reckoning. And it's brought forth these questions of like, well, why is England the wasteland, right? And it has to do with everything we've been talking about, at least in my view, right? So that's, again, like really seeing the mythology and the stories as a map of remembrance. So for me, I tend to connect with the Arthurian legends and the Grail mysteries, because these stories traveled very widely. So for example, the Grail mysteries, which I really focus on in particular, the stories of the Grail were written down actually in many places, right? So we have some stories from Wales about the Grail, and we have some stories from Brittany and northern France about the Grail, even Germany. So these stories traveled very widely, and it's because they traveled widely, and because, we're talking about stories being written down for the first time, but coming from an older oral tradition, we don't really know exactly where they came from. It's hard to like pin them to an exact homeland. And so again, it's because these stories reference England specifically, and especially Logres, like those are the stories that I pay the most attention to and feel are most relevant for our journey of reckoning and remembering with our own heritage, right? And again, that question of like, why is England the wasteland in these stories is so potent, and there's so much to unpack there. So that's my approach. And some people do say that King Arthur and the Arthurian legends are Welsh. I personally feel that that doesn't quite feel true for me, because King Arthur and the Arthurian legends, again, traveled very widely. And we see evidence of King Arthur and his knights in those stories being written across the entire landscape in Britain. And he's described as a king of Britain, not a king of Wales, right? So I feel like there's some complexity there, and I'm sure some people will disagree, and that's fine. That's just my personal feeling. And there are certain places in England specifically that are connected to King Arthur and stories of King Arthur and his knights. So, for example, Stonehenge, there's a really wonderful story about Stonehenge and the wizard Merlin, who's from the Arthurian legends. That's just one example, but there are many. So that is my approach in terms of the mythology. And also, honoring our own deities, our own gods and goddesses. So, for example, in Northern England, we have very clear evidence of a goddess called Brigantia being honored and worshipped. And she had a temple in the area that is now Yorkshire, where there was a perpetual fire that burned for her. And there are other sites that are connected to Brigantia where, clearly people were worshiping her and in communion with her. There are other goddesses as well. I would say that she's one of the most prolific. But again, it's like we have our own traditions. We have stories that are relevant to our heritage. We have our own deities, right? And so in terms of the pre-Christian, pre-colonial Brythonic traditions, there's a lot for us to connect with, actually. We just have to do the work of putting the pieces together. And with these traditions as well, I truly feel that more is not always better, right? So sometimes people are like, oh, well, we've only got these fragments, we've only got these pieces. It's like, well, go really deep with those pieces, so we don't have to have this big, huge, we don't have to have lots and lots and lots of material in terms of our heritage. We can just connect really deeply with what we do have. And so that's something that I really try to do in a 6-month program that I have called the Grail Priestess. And we really go deep into the Grail mysteries, especially the stories about Logres, England. We go really deep into aspects of archaeology. And I really love putting together archaeology with mythology. That's one of my very favorite things to do, because there's kind of this cross-referencing that strengthens the themes and the beliefs and tells us so much, right? So yeah, that's my approach in a very short description. I could literally talk about this for hours. There's so much to say. But yeah, I really feel that it's important for us to be discerning and sensitive when it comes to, reclaiming our pre-Christian, pre-colonial, Brythonic or Celtic past as people with English ancestry. And again, walking between those two truths that England and Wales were once, there was no separation. We were all Brythonic Britain, and the truth of the last, hundreds of years in which Wales has been deeply colonized and deeply harmed because of England. So we can hold all of these truths. And really, my prayer with all of this is that we can be mature enough to honor all of these complexities. I often see people, especially in comment sections on Instagram, of it's either this truth or that truth, right? It's either this or that. And I'm like, can we embrace all of it? Can we really lean into the both and of this and know that there's no true right answer to any of this? And there's no true right answer to history, how we perceive history. All of it has to come from our own relationship and our own personal understanding and our own connection to our ancestors, so that we truly feel that we're walking a path that is integrous and true to who we are and what we value and what we stand for. So, I have intentionally chosen to walk a decolonial path, and that applies to everything I just shared, and also, being an American here on Turtle Island and all that means, right? So yeah, decolonizing ourselves in these ways is really part of that deep reckoning that I feel is so important for the ancestral remembering to come forth in really powerful ways. I see a question here. Tara, do you feel that way because you don't have Welsh ancestry? Yes, I don't have Welsh ancestry, so that's why I really try to leave the Welsh traditions and stories alone as much as possible, while again honoring that there are certain Welsh stories that talk about Britain as a whole and talk about England, and those are important for us to look at. So yeah, I always try to connect with my heritage in a very regionally focused way, and that's last point. That's where I feel that the word Celtic can really be really difficult, because the word Celtic kind of amalgamizes all of these regional cultures into one identity, into one kind of umbrella term. And that really does a disservice to the specific regional identity and cultures of Ireland, Cornwall, England, Wales, Scotland, you know? So
Isle of
there's
Man that has its
Isle
own
of Man, thank you, yes.
so incredible. Like the little islands that obviously like these tiny little islands will have had their own very specific traditions, and these traditions, yes, they're human traditions, but I believe that language and all that we do is just like a sort of extension of the land. Like we are sort of like the land's limbs. We are Mother Earth expression and creating herself in many different ways. And the languages that we speak now, like we all speak the same. Like we all speak English, and like something that keeps coming to me at the moment is like you always hear like to understand a culture. Like if you go on holiday somewhere, they say to understand that culture, learn their language. To know a culture, know the language. So like no wonder we're all so freaking lost. Like none of us know our language. None of us understand our language. And I do believe that the English language has been designed in this way for us to find it real. It's very difficult to return to our origins, and this is why the English language has been designed in this way, because it is not the language of Mother Earth speaking through us, um, to unify ourselves and align ourselves with the earth itself. Um, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and love what you just shared, Stella. And I just want to highlight the work of Carolyn Hillier, who's doing some really beautiful language revitalization around the Proto-Celtic language, which is a dead language. But she's really bringing it forth as a woman from England. She lives on Dartmoor, to bring forth this ancient language, which we can connect with. And it really has this very different energy to English. So I really like to bring Proto-Celtic into my prayers. Like some of you heard me say Molleo earlier, which means praise, thanks. And so yes, language is really important. And in the English language, you know, is a more modern language than other languages like Welsh and Irish and what have you. And it has that energy of yeah, it was developed through, from what I understand anyway, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but through like merchants and trade and like these kinds of things. And so, you know, every language has its beauty, and I don't want to just write English off as like the language of colonizers, but I do find that connecting with Proto-Celtic has a really ancient and sacred energy to it, which can be beautiful to connect with.
Yeah,
And
I was oh no, carry on.
just one last thing, just to say that, just following what we were sharing earlier, you know, our ancestors would have had a very, very small sense of regional identity. You know, many of our ancestors hardly traveled, hardly went anywhere, and some of them went very far and traveled very far. But you know, that sense of regional identity feels really important, and so I try to honor that and bring that into this work as much as possible. And again, there are places where that's not possible. You know, so like Proto-Celtic is a language that was spoken by many different people, potentially as far back as the Bronze Age and into the Brythonic era. And so, you know, that's like a yes, not an example of that. So again, we're putting together pieces as best we can, honoring regional identity and culture and heritage as much as we can, understanding that we've been severed from many of these traditions and cultural lifeways for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I just found what I was going to say. So there's a woman called Laurel Erica, and she is I'd call her an elder of poetry really, and language, and she talks about the origins of the English language and how it was actually in fact designed in such a way to like by church, by empire, to to turn us away from living language in a sense. For example, in many indigenous cultures and tribes over in on Turtle Island now, they will have words that describe like trees as living beings. So like the language that we use completely conditions us and our perspective on reality. and the sacredness around words within the Proto-Celtic language. Um, like, it's such a sacred language just inherently. And the word Celtic, although there are lots of issues that come with that, and it is very problematic. Like, if you've come from my page, you know it's something that I talk about a lot. It is becoming something today that is sort of becoming something new, and I think we need to also, like, we need to walk with the way things are evolving. And so, like, with the word Celtic, like, it shouldn't be used to describe the past. I think it can be used as something for us to connect with each other on today, because we don't have words. It's sort of like a gateway, and an like a gateway into something bigger and more important. But it's not something that can be used to describe one's spiritual identity from the past. Um, yeah, which is, yeah, that's the problem with the word Celtic. Same with, I guess, with the word English, in a sense. Like, a lot of people don't like that we're using the word English, because it's England is empire in a sense, you know, but we're talking about the land and we don't have a word for it. So, like, what do you expect us to do, guys? You know, to all of the people who are like bashing us in the comments for using these terms, and like, what do you expect us to do? What we're doing here is trying, and I think that's the most important thing. What people say to me, where my fluent Welsh speaking friends, they say, just try. Like, it's important that you're trying. It doesn't matter that you can't speak full Welsh. Try and sing a song in Welsh. Make the mistakes. What matters is that you are freaking trying. That you are one of the few people here today trying to return to the earth and care for her once more. That someone who isn't afraid to step into those more difficult and uncomfortable emotions and ways of being. Um, yeah, and yeah, I feel like we're going to be closing this off soon. So, just to touch on the colonialism in the world today, me and Tara are some of the few people talking about Palestine online within the spiritual communities, within these sort of pagan, Celtic, what have you, communities. And it's, yeah, just like, there's no words, like, and I don't think there are many words to say, but I just want us to feel, and to recognize and to be aware of what is happening, um, in whatever way you can. Again, I said, as long as you're freaking trying, like, that's what's important. We don't all have the capacity to be everywhere and do everything all at once. There's a lot going on in this world right now, but it's important, I feel, for those of us who have got the privilege when it comes to time really, who have got the time to sit with what is happening, to sit with what is happening. Because as much as empire tries to make us feel like we have no foot in the door, we do. We have got a big foot in the door right now, guys. And there's like statistics, spiritual statistics, but it's something like, if, like, I think it's 13% of the population of Earth, like, I don't know if I don't want to use the word ascend, but like, become aware of themselves, then the ripple effect will be like very quick. So the more of us that do start becoming aware of what is happening in the world, the quicker that we're going to get to a better world. And this isn't about quick fixes. Like, there are no quick fixes for any of this. It is us all taking responsibility for being human beings on this freaking beautiful planet with all of these beautiful children, beautiful mothers, beautiful fathers, and wanting to make it a better place, because it is possible. It is. That's just what I want to say. It is possible. And ain't no one telling me different, because I will try, and it's a hill I will die on to make this world a better place.
Thank you, Stella. Yeah, that leads to a final point that I would like to make around the continuing harm of colonialism in all its forms. And, you know, history repeats itself until it's made conscious and healed. And so part of my intention with this work is to end cycles of harm and to really reckon with the ways in which colonialism continues today, to not talk about it like it's just in the past, because it's not. And there are many, many examples of that, including Palestine, including Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. Like, you do not have to look very hard to find people who are still being deeply, deeply colonized and harmed. And so my call always in this work is to is for our spiritual practices and for our connection to our ancestors and our ancestral heritage to strengthen us to do this work of decolonizing and to speak up and to take action to help do the important repair work that's needed in the world today, and to do this in ways that are truly honoring of Indigenous people, and really having Indigenous people's voices be first and foremost, and listen to them, and how are they asking us to help, how are they asking us to support their cause, and to disrupt these cycles of harm. So this feels so important. And actually, and this maybe is controversial, but I truly feel that unless we are grounding into the work that needs to be done in this time, in this life, against, let's say, colonialism in particular, unless we're doing that important work, then it doesn't matter if we're connecting with our ancestral heritage or not, our ancestral traditions or not, there is an energy of appropriation. So even connecting with my English heritage and what have you, like I can sit here and honor my English heritage all day, the beauty and the harm, but unless I'm actually harnessing the strength and power of that heritage and the beauty and the magic of that to create change in the here and now, like what am I doing, right? I'm just appropriating my own traditions and bypassing, like spiritually bypassing the here and now, right? What needs to be done here and now. So yeah, you can see on my Instagram post from today, I shared about the Roman Empire and how, the Roman Empire and the English Empire really have a lot of similarities. Like they use the same strategies. And this is just one example of history repeating itself. So we can look into the past and go, oh, wow, look at that history repeating itself. How is it repeating now? Right? How am I part of the colonial system now, the empire now? And I know that a lot of people get hung up on class when it comes to talking about British imperialism, like, oh, my ancestors were working class, they were poor, they didn't colonize anyone. And the truth is that it is more complex than that. And it's more complex than that today, right? And so when I connect with my working class ancestors from England, I can really feel how they both benefited from and were harmed by that system, right? And so, this is something I'm going to be talking about more in Women of the Wells, right? Going into clear examples so we can begin to see the complexity of this system that was the British Empire and, again, continues today. Like the legacy is continuing today. So may we see that we are also part of these modern day empires, right? So we can look back at our ancestors and go, oh, I wish my ancestors had taken a stronger stance and, and stood up for what was right. But like we need to do that now. So that's really like the message I want to end with. And yes, if you go to my page, you'll see various different posts and things talking about decolonizing. I have a little highlight section on my stories about colonialism, reparations, like these kinds of things, like actions that we can take in the here and now to be part of that repair work that's needed for ourselves, for our ancestors, and for the collective.
Yeah. One last thing that I'd like to say to end this is because like you've spoken about a few of your workshops and things that you've got going, and we're on the top of, as you said, creating the world that we are in. We are constantly co-creating with the universe. We are constantly co-creating with the earth. We are not separate beings. We are a part of this story, and we are writing this story together, guys. So let's start writing a better story and realize that we are the ones with the quill in our hands writing, and we are the artists of not only our own lives but the lives of the world around, of the people in the world around us. We are the artists that can save the animals around our local river, for example, and I've got a workshop happening on the 28th of this month. This is for anyone who's wanting to go into, I call it, so it's called Invoking Arwen, and Arwen is an ancient Welsh word, but it likely predates Wales. Well, it predates Wales actually. So a lot of what I speak of, although it is Welsh cultural, it is more of the land. Arwen is a word of this land. And Arwen is an energetic force within the universe that we are able to tap into. And it's a reminder that we are the artists of this life that we live in. And I think this is something that the people of these lands knew. They knew the power of themselves as individuals. They knew the power that they had. And this is what empire didn't like. And it still doesn't like that today. So, yeah, have a look at our work, have a look at our Instagram pages and our websites. And we will definitely be sharing some more in terms of content, as well as other like conversations like this. I believe that the next sort of topic of discussion that we're feeling pulled towards is the topic of animism, from these lands. And yeah, no rush into that. Like, we haven't got a date or anything, but this isn't the end of our conversations. This isn't the end of our connections. And I'm just like so grateful to have met you, someone else who is as passionate about this, even though we've not met in person. I feel like dearly, like, yeah, like a dear, like a remembering of not even just you, Tara, but something that we both share, like memories that we both share from somewhere. And thank you everyone for listening and taking part in this. This is big, and we are writing the stories together.
Yeah, thank you all so much. For those of you who are still with us, that was a long and beautiful conversation, and I hope that I hope that you feel more educated, more empowered, and inspired to really embrace your ancestral heritage. And again, for those of you with English ancestry, I have an introductory workshop coming up at the end of this month on Saturday, July 27th, and I just put the link in the chat there, Women of the Wells. So I hope that I'll see some of you there. And yeah, still really looking forward to future collaborations and conversations.
Yay. All right. Well, blessings, everyone, and enjoy your mornings, evenings, afternoons, whatever it may be.